Here's a fun fact. As of 2023, there were just 6 countries on the globe that don't have any kind of requirement for paid mandated family leave. That's crazy. I wonder what kind of country could possibly do such a thing. This week, we asked the question, why the hell do Europeans get time off and I don't? And whether or not Nevada might just be getting a paid leave law of its own, or a bigger one, or we'll get into it. From Battleborn Progress, this is Born Bytes. My name is Jacob. Let's file a PTO request. So I could start with more recent history on all this. In the United States anyways, a lot of the actual history of paid family leave in particular starts in the 70s and 80s for reasons that'll become clear in a moment. But when we talk about paid family leave, a lot of that means talking about paid maternity leave. And when we talk about paid maternity leave, that means talking about women in the workforce. And so that usually means let's talk about World War II. But here's the fun one. This actually goes all the way back to World War I. That's too exciting. I can't be that excited about World War I. So in 1919, the new International Labor Organization, then part of the League of Nations, now part of the United Nations, well, they adopt something called the Maternity Protection Convention. That does what it says on the tin. Among other things, it calls for 12 weeks of maternity leave, as well as protections for your job once you get back, and healthcare during and after pregnancy. Expressing upon you, the viewer, that it was 1919, getting those protections into something like that convention was a huge victory for early feminists and female trade unionists. That's in large part because, just like you may know about World War II, in World War I, women in the workforce became a major part of international war machines. Though a lot of that labor was unmarried women doing the dangerous work of, say, building tanks or filling shells, a lot of those roles were filled by married women too, and that meant protections for paid family leave. So, after the war, when male labor leaders were agitating for stuff like the 8-hour workday, good work on that by the way, female labor leaders were fighting to just get in the room in the first place. But once they were there, they were also fighting for stuff like equal pay for equal work, and 12 weeks of paid leave. Obviously, that's just the start of this story though, and not the end. For American women in particular, the road to labor rights is long and winding. So just to put this into context, according to the Brookings Institution and data from the Census Bureau, only about 20% of women were what are called gainful workers in the early 1900s. This is work outside of the home. And obviously, categorization matters, right? Because work inside the home is still work. And on top of that, only 5% of married women were gainful workers. And it really can't be overstated how much the educational makeup of the country was radically different pre-World War II and post-World War II. Again, according to Brookings, at the time, only about 2% of Americans 18 to 24 were actually enrolled in college, and of those, only about a third were women. But World War II really is a dividing line, because from 1948 to 2001, the share of women in the workforce doubles from 30% to 60%. That's dipped since then, usually in line with recessions, but in 2021, for instance, the labor force participation rate, I love a streamlined name for a statistic. Well, for women in 2021, it was 55%. For men, it was 60%. But as women are getting into the workforce, access to paid leave for women, and frankly, access to paid paternity leave too, is vanishingly rare or inconsistent at best. So here's an example. In 1978, Congress passes something called the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, which says that employers are not allowed to discriminate against employees just because they're pregnant. That is actually sex discrimination, and that's illegal. The problem here is the only reason that law was necessary was because in 1976, 2 years earlier, the Supreme Court ruled that that kind of pregnancy discrimination actually didn't count as sex discrimination under the text of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Oh, I'm going to file that one under not great. It's not great that they had to go back and fix that one.
Not great, Bob.
On similar-ish lines, in 1987, the Supreme Court rules in hold on. I genuinely have to read this one. California Federal Savings and Loan Association v. Guerra. Got it. Well, in that case, the Supreme Court actually rules in favor of a California law that requires employers give women workers 4 months of unpaid maternity leave and the right to return to their same job when they come back. So it's around this time in the 70s and the 80s that we start to see states start to work around the edges of what paid leave could look like. But it's not until the 1990s that we actually get a federal law saying, okay, maybe we should have a little family medical leave, shouldn't we? This is the Family Medical Leave Act of 1993. That bad boy guarantees up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave as long as you meet certain conditions. Ever since, that's basically been the only federal law that governs this kind of thing. After the 2020 election, Democrats in Congress did briefly consider paid family medical leave as something that they might do. Say, oh, what if we had 12 weeks of paid leave? Wouldn't that be cool? Then they dropped that to 4 weeks, and then they stopped talking about it altogether. So I love compromise. I love legislative compromise.
We've tried nothing, and we're all out of ideas.
So with the federal government not really doing a ton to move the needle on this issue, states have worked around the edges of the Family Medical Leave Act, FMLA, in the meantime. So according to KFF, at least 31 states have done something to expand the definition of FMLA in their states, but usually that's still working around the edges of the law. Stuff like expanding sick leave requirements, or stuff like lowering the threshold under which employers are actually required to abide by FMLA. But when we talk about mandating paid family leave for all employers, or at least even most employers, that's still incredibly rare. Only 12 states in Washington, D.C. have actually put in place some kind of mandate, and of that, it only covers about 23% of American workers, according to the Department of Labor. That does not cover Nevada. I mean, it kind of does. So in 2023, legislators passed requirements for public sector workers to get 8 weeks of paid family leave under certain conditions. And if you do qualify, you get 50% of your wages for the duration of your leave. That's not nothing. But just as context, here's where the rest of the globe is. You may remember the United States is one of only 6 countries with no national mandate for paid family leave. And compared to the global picture, 8 weeks, and frankly, even 12 weeks, is an outlier. Out of 186 countries with requirements for maternity leave, the average leave is 29 weeks. And out of the 109 countries with requirements for paternity leave, the average is 16 weeks. Now that's what I call American exceptionalism. All right, so we've established that the United States is one of vanishingly few countries that actually has no mandate for paid family medical leave, and that Nevada, even if we're counting states that do have such mandates, is only kind of on the list. So is any of that gonna change? Maybe. Hopefully. Fingers crossed. This week, Wednesday to be super precise, legislators heard Assembly Bill 388. Sponsored by Assemblymember Selena LaRue Hatch, this bill would expand Nevada's paid leave requirements from 8 weeks to 12 weeks, cover both public and private sector workers under certain conditions, and it would broaden eligibility requirements to expand to caregivers, domestic violence survivors, and serious illness. And you know what? I'm counting on future me to give you an update on what happened during that hearing right now. Well, if it isn't future me. A relatively quick hearing on this one by legislative standards, so to recap, proponents have argued that this is not just a popular idea supported by literally 80% of Americans, but that it will reduce turnover, increase employee retention, and help new employees lead healthier lives.
We heard a lot of things in testimony, I think the most important of which were the stories from folks who need this desperately. The states that have already implemented paid family medical leave have not had skyrocketing prices, have not had businesses flee their states. They have been able to take care of their employees and still conduct business.
Opponents, mostly business groups, do not think this.
The premise being that the implementation and funding of mandated paid leave programs can be costly to employers, potentially leading to reduced competitiveness and impact on staffing levels.
So, like any bill, this still needs to go through the whole process. Now, once it's heard in committee, then they can amend it or vote on it, and then it gets passed out of committee. And then once it gets passed out of committee, it needs to go to the assembly floor where they have to pass it. If they don't pass it, then that's it. But if they do pass it, then it goes to the Senate where it has to repeat the process again. And only then does it go to the governor's office. Well, I guess it only goes to the governor's office if they don't have to reconcile any differences between the assembly and the Senate. But once it's at the governor's office, then the governor has to sign the thing. So will the governor sign this thing? We don't know for sure. Who can know anything for sure? We're all dust in the wind. But we can look at what happened at something similar in 2023. So back then, Nevada legislators passed a bill, SB 429, that would have required this kind of paid family leave requirement for large employers who are trying to qualify for big Nevada tax abatements. These are like the big tax packages that the state might give to a stadium or the Tesla battery factory. I don't know, just to name a few. Now, that actually passed with bipartisan support out of the Senate, less so in the Assembly, and Governor Joe Lombardo, a Republican, still vetoed it. I'm going to have to read directly from his veto here because I think it's a little instructive and extremely dense. So Lombardo said that the bill, quote, created a unique precondition to a narrowly tailored group of businesses who were pursuing Nevada performance-based tax abatements. I guess it does create a unique precondition, but does it consider whether or not the precondition is cool and good? Much to consider. Future Jacob interrupting past Jacob with the funniest part of this, which is actually that after that veto, Democrats inserted the same language into the A's stadium bill during that whole thing, and Governor Lombardo ended up signing that. So, awesome. Let's go. Yeah, why not? Obviously, this new bill has nothing to do with tax abatements, so that can't be an excuse this time. But we're still going to have to wait and see what actually is going to happen to paid family leave in 2025. For now, though, that's going to do it for this week's episode of Born Bytes. As always, if you like the show, you like what we're doing, hit like and subscribe to make sure you're the first to know when we upload a new episode. But until then, from Battleborn Progress, this has been Born Bytes. We'll see you next week.